One last aspect that I would like to address in regards to the ideas of myth and folklore that we have been talking about this week is whether or not a myth is just a simple story. And of course, as far as we have different words for myth and stories, it would seem that there is something a little bit more specific to the myth that we need to differentiate it from a story. And in as much as the conversations this week have kind of revolved around this idea of people having a larger connection with nature, with their stories, and quote unquote savages, quote unquote barbarians being more part of nature, and religion being more part of culture. Myths in that context are very important because they are connected with a very specific kind of story. And so this quote from Malinowski is showing us that myth as it exists in a savage community that is in its living primitive form is not merely a story told, but a reality lived. It is not the nature of fiction such as we read today in a novel, but it is a living reality believed to have once happened in primeval times and continuing ever since to influence the world and human destinies. This myth is to the savage what to a fully believing Christian is the biblical story of creation, of the fall, of the redemption of Christ's sacrifice on the cross. As our sacred story lives in our ritual and our morality, as it governs our faith and controls our conduct, even so does this myth for the savage. And of course, as I have mentioned before, the Bible for us is a myth. It's the myth of Christian folk. It just happens to be a myth that has been elevated to the level of a religion in our popular discourse, but it fulfills exactly the same function as Malinowski points it out. Just being a product of his time, he made a very specific difference between the two, but we can see in terms of function. And by the way, Malinowski was part of a school that was called the functionalist. So the idea that the specific forms of culture serve a function in our lives. So Malinowski, when he was writing this, was mostly opposing a kind of competing version of intellectual ability during his time, which was called Nature Mythology School, which was mostly based in Germany. Germany is very well known for its tales and its myths, including the Grimm, quote unquote fairy tales. I suppose they're not really fairies, but you get the idea. The Brothers Grimm's tales are very well-known stories that have been changed over the years to represent a variety of parts of the medieval German lifestyle. But the people who studied those myths, again, especially in Germany, have been especially looking at the natural phenomena and the role that nature plays um, in those stories. And the idea for these writers and for most people who were interested in folk tales by then was the fact that there is a natural reality that is at the core of whatever tale, whatever myth that exists out there. And people, by their stories, just expand the natural phenomena that they see to make sense out of it through the myth. And part of the surrounding text of this particular extract, Malinowski talks about lunar mythologists, about forest mythologists, so people who are essentially reducing every kind of myth you could think of to the moon or to the forest or to whatever, that these things have a very specific meaning. And of course, I'm using the forest in this example because we have talked about the forest a couple of times this week. And in as much as there are forests everywhere and that people don't know what's in the forest, it should not be particularly surprising that you find some weird monsters, some weird humans living in the forest, or maybe coming from the other side of the forest. In that context, the forest just represents the unknown, and whatever belongs in the unknown is kind of the model that is behind these stories. And so, there's a whole lot of people that try to make sense out of these stories, and but in terms of nature. And when Malinowski is pointing this out, he is showing that this is much more a function of culture itself to have a mythical story about nature. And in fact, it would be a mistake, as far as he sees it, that to look for the same natural element in every culture that has a mythological story, because of course different cultures are different, and as a result of that, they should have different ways to make their myths. So, Malinowski and all of this early school of anthropology and part of the antiquarians that we mentioned Wednesday, and the folklore studies kind of are existing on that cusp of making sense of other cultures with more or less deft understanding of what it means to be not European at the time. That being said, another part of this story is also what becomes known in France as sociology, which is pretty close to anthropology, at least back then, because there are a lot of people who are looking at these different aspects of society in that same regard. And we come back to Fraser now, that we have mentioned earlier in this course, to look at his interpretation of a very specific myth that he saw in ancient Rome. In antiquity, this sylvan landscape was the scene of a strange and recurring tragedy. On the northern shore of the lake, right under the precipitous cliffs on which the modern village of Nemi is perched, stood the sacred grove and sanctuary of Diana Nemorensis, or Diana of the Wood, or Diana of Nemi. The lake and the grove were sometimes known as the Lake and Grove of Aricia, and the town of Aricia, the modern Lauricia, was situated about 3 miles off at the foot of Alban Mount, and is separated by a steep descent from the lake, which lies in a small crater-like hollow on the mountainside. In this sacred grove there grew a certain tree around which, at any time of the day, and probably far into the night, a strange figure might be seen to prowl. In his hand he carried a drawn sword, and he kept peering warily about him, as if every instant he expected to be set upon by an enemy. So here we have a pretty nice natural description of a place, right? We were talking about nature just a second ago, and Fraser is repeating this tale that exists in a bunch of antique books about this king, or as we're going to see, this character that lives in the forest, but kind of prowling. This again, nature in this context representing the unknown, and in the sense that these people tend to think that they are cultured, the parts of nature seem to them very inscrutable and weird. But most especially here, the word that Fraser uses, that this place is sacred. This is a sacred grove, a sacred lake, and the sacred part of the story is also what Malinowski was talking about up here slide, that the myth is a sacred story. And what the sacred means in this sense is very far reaching. It could be a story, it could be a place, it could be a person, it could be an object, it could be an idea. But the sacred is a very specific category that relates directly to aspects of myth and religion at large. Emile Durkheim, a French sociologist of the early 20th century, was very instrumental in our understanding of the sacred, because he was essentially using the sacred as a category, and not only a category, but a specific separate category for our knowledge. Sacred things are not simply those personal beings that are called gods or spirits. A rock, a tree, a spring, a pebble, a piece of wood, a house, in a word, anything can be sacred. A right can have sacredness. Indeed, there is no right that does not have it to some degree. There are words, phrases, and formulas that can be said only by consecrated personages. There are gestures and movements that cannot be executed just by anyone. So the sacred refers to something that is a little bit more privileged than the public story. And this is where we need to separate the folklore that is gossip, that is available by just repetition, and the very sacred story that are part of the myth that is something that is the part of your unique knowledge as a people, as a group, as a village, maybe as a gender, maybe as an age group, whatever it is. But the myth as a sacred story is a story that is detained very specifically by a very specific group. And in the context of Fraser's story of a sacred grove, the person who lives there is a sacred king. A sacred grove, there grew a certain tree around which at any time of the day and probably far into the night, a strange figure might seem to prowl. In his hand he carried a drawn sword, and he kept peering warily about him as if in every instant he expected to be set upon by an enemy. Who is this enemy in this case? If this person is so sacred, so powerful, what is that person facing with? Well, we are told that he was a priest and a murderer, and the man for whom he looked was, sooner or later, to murder him and hold the priesthood in his stead. Such was the world of sanctuary. A candidate for the priesthood could only succeed to office by slaying the priest, and having slain him, he held office till he was himself slain by a stronger and a craftier. So there is this story that exists in ancient Rome of a king that is kind of living in fear of being murdered by somebody whose job would be to replace him eventually. This is perhaps pretty common feeling for kings and queens who kind of obtain their seat for reasons that are not pretty obvious, but kind of a matter of privilege, but also live in fear of assassination. This is maybe something that relates to the story of Julius Caesar, of course, one of the emperors of Rome who was notoriously assassinated by somebody who was stronger and craftier, in this case, his own son. And that person, Julius Caesar, was a priest as much as he was a king. He was a person who was in charge of the state religion as much as he was in charge of the state government. Now, of course, just a few years later, you have another conurbation that happens when the descendants of Julius Caesar, the successors of Julius Caesar, are not just the state religion of Rome, of Roman religion, they are also the heads of the Christian religion. Once they turn to Christianity, then you have the story of a king that is also a priest of a large-scale religion. And it just so happens that in that particular religion, Christianity, there is a character who is somewhat of a king, but also someone who needs to be killed for the prophecy to be realized of the people knowing that God is upon us, that Jesus Christ exists for the very purpose of showing us what humanity is. And this particular king in Nemi, the particular king that exists in Rome, the particular king of the Bible, are all part of a mythical representation of a character that has this very tragic existence to themselves. This sacred king, as much as he lives in a sacred place, may also be attacked, may also be assailed by something else, something that is outside of their power. So the sacred here is an important part because as much as our myths seem to be all powerful to a certain extent, our myths are also going to be replaced, are also going to be part of a much larger story that may or may not be under our control. So the myth as a sacred story serves the same purpose as this king that we are told from Fraser and as these sacred things that we are told from Durkheim, mostly by the fact that they are part of this larger world that is our world in many respects, but is also living by slightly different rules than us. They have this very specific function in terms of Malinowski. In this case, though, being murdered by the successor priest or whatever it is that is happening to them, but they exist for a specific reason. They are not just, existing, wandering the land. They have a mission, they have a very specific role. So these mythical things live by different rules than us, albeit in our world, and their behavior is very different. Most of us are not living in fear, roaming around a tree to make sure that we are not getting murdered, even though it could be possibly within the realm of our existence. We do not live by those rules. And so we end up being kind of fascinated, amazed, awed by these characters because we are trying to make sense out of their existence for our own. They give us this sense of perspective that we do not necessarily have upon ourselves. We can think of, what if I was this person living in this situation? What would I do if my role was to be murdered in order to be replaced? These things are helping us live to a certain extent. They are also helping us deal with some fears that may exist. In that case, maybe this successor could be a stranger. Maybe it could be a barbarian or a savage, the people that Malinowski is telling us about. So the idea here of things that have to do with the sacred also have to do with our understanding of what nature is and what we consider to be natural. We might not consider our lives to be naturally a fear of the other that is coming to murder us. However, we have, as part of our natural life, this understanding that it is a possibility, and we also have these stories that help us make sense of what would happen if we were in this situation. So, what is natural to us, as opposed to what is cultural, of course, we could think of living in fear and having a paranoid lifestyle as being a cultural space, but we could also think of it as a natural space according to which we have developed strategies that allow us to deal with that, to face it head on in our daily life. Now, in terms of what we are going to talk about for the rest of the semesters, these other characters, we must necessarily think of them, these others, as it being both part of our natural world, but also being part of our cultural world. And how we make sense out of them from a natural standpoint will also have a repercussion on how we make sense out of them from a cultural standpoint. What these things mean to us, what functions they have for us, and maybe what lives they have on their own, are not just a reflection of the way we think, but they are also very much a function of the way we are.